University is a whole different thing here in Mexico. In comparison to the United States, for example, it is not as expensive and it is generally more accessible than in other countries. We have our fair share of overpriced private schools, but generally speaking, it is widely available to a certain extent. I went in right after high school, and although I wanted to pursue a career in music, it was simply not possible for me. Accounting did cross my mind to follow in my mother's footsteps, but I quickly realized that would have been a huge mistake. First, I would like to start by saying that I did enjoy the first part of my time in university. I did quarters instead of regular semesters, which meant I will finish sooner, but would have less free time, and that sounded great, and I still would not have wanted it otherwise. I studied digital art and animation, but discovered a big range of other things like 3D, video editing, photography, and other production related things. I went in expecting a lot. I think a lot of people fall for this false idea of how a school will be or is supposed to be. Obviously, the sales pitch will not be anything like the actual experience, but when you're someone who has disliked school all of their life, you kind of get your hopes up, right? You'll finally study something you like and it'll make you feel good and you'll enjoy it and you'll learn and it will be your career in the future. You're gonna live off that, etc. And partially it is true, but I emphasize the word partially. My past experiences were really bad, and I always had the thought that university was going to be the best next thing, and it wasn't. Something else that I wish I would have known at the time is how to properly manage disappointment, because I thought they were gonna teach me a lot and that I was gonna get the full learning experience and in depth, and that might come across as naive, and it is. I think we are encouraged to follow the quote-unquote natural path of life according to society, and we don't really know what to think or what to do when it doesn't really work out. Instead of what I expected, we barely scratched the surface in a lot of things: software, skills, techniques, and approach to art in general. Most of what I know is thanks to extensive internet searching, YouTube videos, and online courses, as well as what just a handful of dedicated teachers taught me. I'm thankful to have had the guidance, but overall it was such a mediocre experience. These experiences I'm talking about and I'm going to talk about were mostly pre-pandemic. My last 2 or 3 quarters were spent at home, and the school was certainly not prepared to make this change from physical to digital, and it took them a really long time to make things work for us. My coordinator, as well as various teachers and members of the school, were sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, and later on, I ended up glancing at their transphobic behavior. Here's something funny. We used to present a big project every quarter, and they used to make us wear suits and look supposedly tidy, prepare a presentation, a small stage, and even buy snacks for everyone who was invited. And speaking about the dress code, that meant sticking to basic concepts of masculinity and femininity, because if we were to break them, that could do some social harm. Essentially, if you're trans or non-binary, it's a huge, I never swear in my channel, but it's a huge fuck you. Pre-transition, I was asked to remove my acrylic nails, tie my hair, and get rid of earrings and other jewelry, not to mention any traces of makeup. Women were not allowed to wear much makeup or even pants or ties if they wanted to, and they had to stick to quote-unquote normal nail polish colors. I think you can imagine that this was stressful, to say the least. Among other things, we had to deliver our work in a CD with a handmade label on top, and we used to present our project in front of judges and an audience, and most of the judges and people that rated our projects were middle-aged, mostly men, that didn't entirely approve of what we did, and they were the type of person who enjoyed chewing us out in front of a lot of people to reinforce their authority and power. Also, most of them had absolutely very little to no knowledge about what we did and what we were about to present, and their idea of what we did, animation in general, was those handmade funny cartoons from almost half a century ago. No joke. We used to send a detailed document about our work before each project, but it was pointless. They read bits and pieces, but rarely the whole thing, and it would rarely serve a purpose. The very few young judges were essentially not interested in what we did, and honestly, I cannot blame them, and they were forced to be there but couldn't even bother to put up with the act. Most of my teachers were very distasteful people in general, and a huge percentage, I will say 85 to 90% was mediocre as well, and so were most of my classes. I count I think four or five teachers that I think were decent people. Two of them only taught us for 1 quarter. And I would like to mention one of those two. Her name is Katia, and she encouraged me to seek help, psychological help. And if it wasn't for her, I would not have started my transition in the first place, and that is something I will never forget. As much as we like to generalize places and organizations, not all of the apples in the basket are exactly rotten, but you just kind of have to dig deep to find the ones that are not. Going back to the idea of disappointment that I mentioned previously at the beginning, in my school they especially told us we could pick certain classes based on what we liked, tailored a bit more towards our skills. I wanted more classes related to script writing, and I had no control over it in the end. Another thing that happened during my time was that no licenses for the softwares we require in order to work and learn were provided for us. We had to rely on pirated software, and a lot of days were essentially wasted because we would spend hours and change just trying to get the software in question and get it to work on poorly maintained machines. Most of the time we spent it in an enclosed hot computer lab with a window that didn't work, and the people who had authority over it didn't care enough to pay for the reparation of said window. Our school did end up doing some remodeling, but only because they were sanctioned by the state for not doing so. If allowed, things would have continued to be the way they were. At one time, a friend of mine shared this in his stories and was punished by the school for doing so. This isn't entirely related to the school, but I certainly do not miss packaged convenience store food and Clover cigarette packs. My friends and I were this group of walking chimneys with cameras, and it was quite funny. We had analogic photography at school for just a quarter, and I ended up really liking it. But the bad thing is that it can turn expensive very quickly, and that the very few stores that develop film in my hometown are essentially closed now. One of the reasons I think things felt incomplete during my time in university is because they tried to teach us so many things in so little time, and they stretched themselves too thin. We ended up not even going deep into anything in particular but 3D. At some point, we were supposed to switch the animation software we use, which was Animate, to some others, but we never did. We spent some time with After Effects and Adobe Character Animator, but again, very briefly. On a more personal side, university did have a psychological toll on me because everyone has a breaking point, and it is important to try and take care of yourself and don't set yourself on fire just to keep others warm. I reached a peak point in my anxiety, continuous self-harm behavior, and self-mutilation, chain smoking, and I reached my highest weight, and my insecurities and self-doubt were essentially destroying me. There was a time where I even contemplated suicide again. I'm better now, and I was able to lose the extra weight, went to therapy, learned to manage my anxiety, stopped my self-mutilation, started my transition, stopped smoking right after COVID, and overall learned how to tolerate school a bit more, at least those last quarters. There's no sense in constantly complaining about things. Sometimes we have to do the best with what we have, and that's fine. It's not always our fault, and systems are not perfect. I understand not everyone's situation is the same, but I always like to try and not just simply stand still. Even if it doesn't work out, at least it is worth knowing you did your best. Lastly, I'm thankful that my mother was able to support me throughout these years, that I got to learn what I learned despite the terrible experience, and I'm happy that I learned how to improve my life, that I met nice people amongst a bunch of generally horrible ones, but right now I'm just super ready to move on. Speaking of moving on, there is something that I experienced right after finishing school, and some late night research showed me I wasn't alone on this one: Post-Grad Depression. I wasn't going to talk about this originally, but honestly it just felt wrong not even mentioning it. There are common quote-unquote symptoms that indicate post-grad anxiety or even depression: feeling constantly worried and fearful about the future, feeling a lack of support right after finishing school, feelings of failure if you're unable to find work in your area of specialty in a considerably reasonable length of time, and especially with how things are right now, that can be quite difficult. Scholars and psychologists often consider these behaviors as a form of result related to addictive behavior. While I cannot speak for others, I can speak for myself and say that I think this is true. In my personal life, at least, I got addicted to spending a lot of time in school, stressing out, even interacting with others, and now that I don't wake up every day and stress about exams, projects, work, homework, it just feels like something is missing, which makes mundane things like living arrangements, daily life, personal connections, chores, everything can feel overwhelming. Things like loneliness, general sadness, decreased motivation, loss of interest, disorganization, and even hopelessness are present in our lives or can be after graduation. They certainly have managed to be part of my life in recent times. And I would like to say that this doesn't always look the same, obviously. I could experience all of those things and simply decide to sit in my room playing games that I like, or watching films, trying to shift my focus from life to something else, compulsively listening to music, driving to nowhere in particular, and buying things for myself just to have something to look forward to. But other people might engage in different practices like potting, social gatherings, drinking, or doing overly happy and enthusiastic activities. It generally is different for many of us. What I'm trying to say by mentioning all of this is that this is something more common that we like to think. I believe we have reached a point where we don't even realize it because it is so normalized and part of our society now. Now, here are some resources that I found that might help someone out. I would share what works for me, but to be frank, I'm still trying to keep myself together and figure this thing out, and I'm still vulnerable to be quite frank. And well, at any rate, here are some helpful insights. Planning for the short or long term, relocating, returning home, have something to look forward to regarding your living situation. Something else that I found that was helpful was having a social network or circle of people and support. Talking about it helps as well, and many people experience similar things to you, so don't be afraid to speak up and seek support. If it isn't with your circle of friends or family, try online forums like Reddit or any social media that has a community that can listen to you. Managing stress by exercising or even having a routine, and generally managing your time so it accommodates your psychological needs. And last, explore and consider other opportunities. Broaden your mind. Some of these things may work for someone, may even not work for someone, but speaking for myself, I am trying each and every one of them. I really am. And what I can tell you is that they're not useless. I would encourage you, if you're going through this, to just try it for yourself. There's nothing to lose if you do. And finally, well, just remember that success is relative and that the burden of your weight is temporary. Bad days do not last forever. Okay then, well, that was my little rant about art school and my experience in general, and I know it will certainly be different in comparison to other people, but I really wanted to share this with someone, and if this helped you out in some way, then good. Thank you so much for watching. I'm gonna use this portion to shamelessly promote my Patreon page. I now have a Patreon. If you feel like my content is worth it, just please consider supporting me. If not, no problem at all. Thank you so much for watching again. Take care of yourselves. Use hand sanitizer and keep using your masks. Goodbye.